the officer should not have pushed the lady away that roughly. I don't think that was necessary. I think that he could have spoken to her. And however, the constable was saying, in a situation that is volatile, emotions do run high.
I've worked very closely with police officers, and it's a very, very tough job. One of the things that we always have to consider on the arrest side and the arrestee side of police work, I hate to say it, crazy can just hide. I mean, it just pops up on you. This is something that law enforcement officers train for and try to manage. But the thing that we have to look at is, yes, one single officer demonstrating bad conduct, but I think on the other side of the ledger was we saw 3 or 4 other officers that surrounded the lady to keep her from being in contact or shoved again by that same officer, and the other officers seemed like they were making a standard arrest. However, any circumstance can get out of control because we all have adrenaline, and all of us, when we get that adrenaline pumping and those endorphins start going, we want to get even, and that will lead to misconduct. The idea is that we've trained our officers to the point or to a level that they can manage that, and that's what we expect when we say protect and serve.
You find officers getting killed in family disturbances and also traffic stops. More officers get killed in those situations. But at that particular situation, there was a lot of mistakes made. Before they brought him out, they should have isolated her. She should have been isolated from the area. What she was trying to do was show emotions to her husband or boyfriend, who he was. And the officer should never have put his hand on her, never should have pushed her. That's good training. And what you do, you use this right here when you're in those type of situations, because that situation was totally under control. There was plenty backup there, we call it backup. And there was no reason for her to even be involved in that area, that scene, because they had plenty other areas to take him over that way. They didn't have to bring him toward her. And also those officers that were there and saw the man that pushed the lady, they should have stepped in also and reprimanded him. A lot of times what we do, we don't take control of the people who we work with. Politicians, stick with politicians. I don't care how rotten they are, they stick with them.
That's right.
And the thing that we need to look at is that when we find something that is not right, we got to take a stand. And when you look at the Constitution of the United States, that Constitution don't have any color in it at all. It says all was created equal. But we know that is not the fact. That is not what's happening. And it seemed to be that all the rights that minorities have had, some politicians are trying to take them away. Voting rights for one. That shouldn't even be mentioned. That should be a right to do that anytime. Why should I have to go to Washington, D.C. and get Congress and Senate together and say I can vote? That's my right under the Constitution. But you see, that's been messed up. So this is the thing that I'm saying, and we hide our heads in the sand too much. And I know I'm through. It bothers me because we want to get in there and work on what's going on wrong, and we got a race problem.
What advice would you give not only community leaders and communities themselves, but also law enforcement leaders in effective first steps at breaking down some of the barriers, discourse, and distrust that we've talked about today?
My answer to that question is that community policing is police officer getting to know the community get to know that police officer. That was a program that was working well here in Lubbock for many years. When you know someone and someone knows you, you have that trust factor. But when you don't know an individual, all you see is that police officer coming in the neighborhood taking care of business. Well, you don't trust that officer because you see that officer taking care of business. But if you got to know that officer, you could trust that officer. And he could trust you, or she could trust you.
John Maxwell says everything rises and falls with leadership. So I believe it starts with the leadership of the communities and the leadership of the police department in the city coming together, devising a plan, and then implementing that plan, which I believe does include the police officers getting to know on a first name basis people in the community. But I believe it starts with the leadership. If the leadership steps out, takes a step to pull people together, and then it'll funnel down from there.
What steps need to be taken to move the police function from a us versus them approach to a we are all us approach?
Communications, get to know one another, and once you get to that point where the police officers are trained, well trained, to interact with people, and that don't let it get to the point where it's a us and them situation. We get to know one another, interact with each other, and then we're going to have a better relationship between law enforcement, penal institutions, judicial system, etc.
I believe part of the solution starts with cultural education. If I understand your culture, you understand my culture, then we can better relate.
Having worked with police and worked in an academy, a police academy, I don't think any officer actually starts out with us versus them approach, or I just think, as I said earlier, crazy can hide. But I do think that community leaders need to know a couple of things that I think is really important for them to know. One is, if they see an habitual abuser that's reported to you, and you don't have to be an elected official, you could be a minister or head of a sports team or whatever, and you see habitual abuse by an officer overasserting himself, my suggestion would be to go to the police department and visit with the Internal Affairs Agency. And if the Internal Affairs agent takes your statement, they'll look into it, they'll do an investigation. If you're dissatisfied with that, then go to the FBI and let them investigate the department. Because this is a system, so follow the protocols. And if the protocols don't work, then you want to take and look at the media. You want to look at all the other alternatives, including legislation, to take and clean up a mess. Because one officer, only one, can make a major mess for a department. And a fine example is that what occurred in Ferguson. And no citizen or no organization should take and let something that they observe to go unattended to in that law enforcement agency. We all have a responsibility to do that, and we need to take that responsibility. We need to take it seriously and follow through with it.
Communication, involvement in the community. Speak up when an officer is an abuser. All of us have been trained as officers to step up when we see an abuser. When we see him conducting a bad traffic stop, a bad arrest, all of us have been trained to speak up, step up, stop the action. So for those of us that don't, we should also take action.
What are your thoughts in regards to how the media impacts the relationship between minorities and law enforcement?
The media is in the job of getting ratings, and ratings are driven mostly by negative information, negative things going on in society. That's what draws people in. You look at any newscast, social media, any of those things, they like to perpetuate issues. You look at, on social media, you see fights, people are drawn to fights. I believe that's part of what impacts it, just the negative piece.
What I'd like to add to that is that media is essential to a civil society, and civility is predicated on the information that we receive. I think the real question becomes, it's not what media does or what media says, it's what we as reasonable people will understand and act upon. That becomes the key. We cannot be driven by the sensationalism of media. That, I think years ago we had a term called yellow journalism, where we practice sensationalism in our media. We've got to be mature enough, and we're intellectually smart enough as a country to understand when we're being had. And if we don't understand when we're being had, then we're not going to be a country much longer. So we've got to be really smart about this and understand that media reports information, we decipher information, and we make the decisions. And if we're unable to do that, then media will just drive us all over the place, and we'll have nothing but immeasurable misconduct. And I don't think that that's happening.
What can city governments do to help prevent violent and deadly encounters between citizens and police?
What the city police department can do is to educate our police officers how to respond to situations And also, in the meantime, what we can do as city officials is also bring the community in. And as we have a dialogue, we need to have a dialogue. And it seems like that we've gotten away from that dialogue that we should have with the media, with the citizens and the police department. And it's good for the media to be there because everybody's not going to be there at the dialogue. But it's good that people know that we have a relationship, or we are forming a relationship with the community and with law enforcement and with government. Just the thing that we don't understand is that politics drives a lot of this. There's a lot of mean political things going on in America today, and it's just drifting right on down in our society. And so the police and citizens is caught in the mix of these political fights and issues.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there were false narratives coming out of that shooting, the night of the shooting, when the police chief said that person wasn't being sought, and he was. And there were witnesses who gave some false testimony. It took many weeks to square that situation away. In the meantime, we've had, and video has shown, we had a question about the police cameras, where there have been unjustified shootings. So that's why I think Ferguson is probably the worst example of what's really happening. And there are unjustified shootings, terrible shootings out there. We've seen them these last few weeks.
With the U.S. beating out the old USSR in terms of prison population, it's become apparent that our prison system is flawed. 39% of prisoners in the U.S. are black, and 75% are from drug charges, from the drug war. So it's obvious that the prison system doesn't work. A lot of the soft criminals come out hard. So what's the best alternative to the prison system that we have now?
The prison system is designed to only make more prisons. That's what it does. And it does an absolute disservice because it has such a huge population of African American men and other minority men that have been locked up. One of the things that will help, one is that we get a more effective adjudication system. We definitely need to have judges that will live by the spirit of the law and look at the letter of the law. The other thing that I think is really important about this is when a gentleman or a young man has served his or her time, or a young person has served his or her time, we need to restore them to citizenship. We need to give them the right to vote. We need to allow them to get educated. Make more certain that when we convict someone and send them to prison, that the person committed a crime. Right now, the system is so skewed, it's very difficult to understand whether or not someone that is in prison, is it justice that got them there, or some other issue that drove this decision of the courts to have them found guilty to spend 10, 15, 20 years of their life. I think we have more people incarcerated in our country than I think any other of the developed nations. We've got to do better than that. That's a sad commentary for a nation that is so rich with so much intelligence that what we do is find it easier to lock up someone rather than coach them and train them and make them an effective citizen. And I think the last time I looked at the numbers, we were spending more money on a prisoner to survive in a prison than we spend on someone to get an education. Part of the problem is that the drug arrests that have been made and the young men and women that have done their time, we've got to get legislation in place that will get them back into the citizenry so they can vote and become working, productive citizens. Right now, if you know a young man that has been incarcerated, trying to find a job, trying to get back into a public institution, because now we have on an application, we ask if you have been incarcerated, if you've been charged with a crime, have you been arrested? We've set up so many obstacles that we've manufactured a system of frustration that further contributes to the criminalization and misconduct of men and women that are trying to change their lives.
Dr. Ferguson, the legislature actually is looking at recidivism rates.
Yes.
They are actually working on, one of the big problems of this has been the sentencing. The sentencing has been very, no statistics, but I think we addressed this one. It's been really disproportionate on minorities.